Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our webinar today, Traceability and Transparency, Building Sustainable Supply Chains, presented by SGInnovate and Bain and Company. My name is Brian, and for those of you who don't know about us, we are a government-owned organization in Singapore that invests in and helps build deep tech startups, talent, and communities. At SGInnovate, our work involves connecting the global deep tech ecosystem, working with entrepreneurial scientists to bring their innovative research from lab to market, as well as developing deep tech talent. Today, we have a group of amazing speakers who will be exploring how businesses can develop and leverage traceability to build a supply chain that is effective, reliable, resilient, and sustainable. I'd like to encourage our audience here today to share their thoughts on this topic and engage with our speakers by using the Q&A box below. And with no further ado, I'll now pass the time to our moderator for today, Jerry. Jerry, please.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Brian. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depends where you are, to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm very excited together with our co-panelists to be sharing this webinar. I'll introduce you to our panelists in a minute, but before I do that, very quick introduction of myself. My name is Jeremiah. I'm a partner at Bain at our Singapore office. I lead our sustainability practice here in Southeast Asia. Also, our Global Sustainability Innovation Center, which is based in Singapore, and together with the Singaporean government, launched last year, really focusing on helping clients advance their agenda in their most important sustainability issues. The mission of the center is to help innovation, which is extremely important if we want to tackle some of our planet's greatest sustainability issues and challenges, and for sure, traceability and the supply chain is one of them, for which we're going to talk for today. Before I make the introductions, just a little bit of a background on the importance of this topic. Global supply chains are getting a lot more complex. Not only that, but also we do see on a daily basis even that there are different types of risks and different types of shocks that can affect supply chains as time goes by. We are actually living right in the middle of one of the most severe supply chain issue, clogs up in the world that we've seen so far. Container rates have increased almost tenfold, 15-fold in some cases since 2019. Across all sectors and industries, there are shortages in raw material and various inputs that is required. And many companies, particularly in the industrial sector, the one thing they are looking for more than anything is to increase visibility and transparency in their supply chain so they can go back to their customers and be able to commit to delivery dates and be able to commit to the variety of products and be able to commit to the SKUs that they have signed up for. We're also seeing increased potential regulation coming through for traceability in supply chains. Governments are making it more specific and more stricter to understand where supply chains are starting, where do they end, where are the sources, are they certified, are they within the expected ESG criteria, and so on. However, even all that is going on, in a recent survey that we did, we found out that only 60%, more than 60% of companies actually have zero visibility on their supply chain. So in other words, even all this is going on, still the majority of companies in our survey could not see what's happening in their supply chain, could not go through their the depth of their tier 2s and tier 3s to be able to understand the risks that exist, and as a result, creating a lot of blind spots. We also see that for companies who are using traceability the right way today, it's actually a value add to their business. It's actually a differentiator. And in most businesses today, particularly for those that could be in certain commoditized environments, having that differentiator is very important. And we're going to hear a lot about it actually today from our panelists. Finally, it's important to highlight that traceability in supply chain is particularly important for this part of the world, for Asia Pacific, given that 80% of trade routes, bilateral trade routes, are starting from Asia. And even if we look at some of specific supply chain chokes right now, such as in the semiconductor industry, a lot of it is initiating from this part of the world. So a very important topic for the world, but a very important topic for Asia Pacific specifically. So with all this in mind, we've actually put together a fantastic panel here today, which I'd like to take a little bit of time to introduce. We're going to have Gary Law from Dimuto, and he's going to share with us in a minute a little bit more about himself. We're having Paul Nicholson from Ollum, and we're having Amy Wan as well from Trimco. If I may ask each one of you to quickly introduce yourself, maybe Amy, we can start with you first. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon to you, depending on where you are. I'm the CEO of Trimco Group. Trimco Group has been traditionally a manufacturer of trims for apparel industry. So that means the backnet label where the brand name is, and the care label on the side with a lot of text, the hang tag and the packaging for the garment industry. So the company was founded in Hong Kong about 44 years ago as a trading company, and very quickly moved to manufacturing. And recently, actually not so recently, 10 years ago, we have started to build an IT platform to manage the can content data, the very boring text on the side of your garment for Nike. And most recently, we have further developed that platform to manage the can content, as well as the sustainability and analytics based on the can content, and certificates for the supplier of the garment, also on the IT platform. So I'm very happy to be here to talk more about our business later. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much. Paul, maybe we can go to you next.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I work for Ollum International. We're a large commodity agribusiness. Cocoa, coffee, edible nuts, grains, rice, cotton, spices, dairy would be some of the products you would know us for, where we're quite large in those segments. As the consumers involved in their need for comfort, we've needed to respond with systems, digital platforms, to answer to those needs for comfort. That's also crossed over with answering the regulatory environment as well. So to do that, we've built two platforms. One is @Source, which is a customer-facing platform that simplifies sustainability impact. So we're able to locate the event, which is the transparency, with the identity or location of that event through the @Source system. Generally, that's looking at interventions to generate positive impacts. The other system we have is Jiva, which goes the opposite direction. There we're taking transparency to the farm level, and there we're wanting to take in what they need to know about global markets, whether that's the regulatory environment, inputs, locations for delivery, prices available, so that the farmers themselves can make more informed decisions about the crops they're making and improve their quality.
Great, thank you so much. And Gary, if you don't mind.
Yeah, hi, my name is Gary, and I'm the founder and CEO of Dimuto. What has happened is I started a company, Dimuto, based on the 15 years of being in the finance field, and then having another 10 years being in a farmer and a fruit seller business, very much in the fresh produce business for almost 10 years, where I manage the farms, where basically we pack and then we sell to a big group of people in Asia, including the Middle East. And combining all these lessons, we eventually found that the problem in trade is really a big problem because of a messy middle. And this messy middle is really the problem that we're trying to solve. And to talk about trade, we always see two things. And one is the movement of goods on one side, and then the other opposite direction is the movement of money. So it is one trade, but there's two different information going one direction and the other going the other direction. And what we're trying to do is reduce the friction, have that kind of traceability and transparency so that we can actually tell one complete story.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. I can't wait to hear about the importance of the technology in traceability, which of course is a major element. But before we do that, maybe we can take a little bit of a step back and start from the broader question, also in the benefit of all of our audience here. to really just set the basics a little bit around traceability and what does it mean for different companies and for different industries. And with that in mind, I'd like to kick off with maybe the first question, Paul, if you don't mind, to tell us, what does it mean for your company and your industry, traceability, and how important is to have that level of transparency?
Yeah, so thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's a must. This is no longer maybe, but it's a must in the food industry. And the reason why is the consumer is expecting it, and more with digital platforms, the consumers demand it. So in order to sell a food product years ago, you simply had to source it and deliver it under regulatory norms of food safety. But what would happen is events would occur. And as I said, traceability or transparency is about the event itself. So how do I give you a window into what my supply chain looks like? Whereas traceability is about the linkage of those events, so I can identify the location where those events occur. Early on, that was an internal exercise. The transparency and traceability systems you would see were very much about warehousing, contract closing, how much was sold, who was it sold to, and how do I close the contract. Over time, especially in forestry, where there was a need to look at the provenance of timber and ensure that we weren't deforesting in the industry. And then later on with food safety, especially in the vegetables category, where you saw a lot of food safety events, traceability became something else. Traceability became very much critical to understanding the location of, say, a salmonella event. That helped build on those original internal systems and led us to a more robust modern system. With the advent of interest in sustainability, then, we've been able to access those same systems to create linkages to our value chain. I think oftentimes people think traceability is linear from, say, the farmer to the product, but it's really more of a bush. You'll be tracing your documentation, you'll be tracing your packaging sourcing, you'll be tracing inputs on the farmer level, and each one of those moments in your supply chain will have its own networks feeding into your systems. You do all of this to ensure that when the customer has an interest, you're able to answer that question. Should you not be able to do that, then I don't know that you'll survive very long in the food supply chain.
Understood. Great insights. And I like how you differentiated that point around transparency and traceability and the importance of each one of them is on their own, but then even more important and more valuable when they're linked together. I'm not sure if Amy or Gary, you'd like to provide a perspective from your angle.
Yes, I think from the apparel industry, I cannot agree more. Not only food, people care about where the material is coming from, where the cotton is coming from, and where is it made. Is there any child labor in making my clothes for brands like Disney? It's very important that their label is not seen in the collapsed building or in the hands of a child. So in that sense, transparency and traceability is critical to big international brands, that they're able to pinpoint and locate exactly where the garment comes from, what is the content of the garment, and how they can report and how they can improve in the future planning of where they manufacture and where they source.
Great. And Gary, any perspective from any?
No, I was just gonna add Paul's comment about transparency and traceability, because when people talk about traceability, most of us say, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of cost and we have to do a lot of things. But I can see where business owners and people are concerned about that. But I think the benefit, like what Paul said earlier and Amy is also alluding to, is that the transparency part actually is really the benefit. Because how are you going to be transparent when you don't really have the data to actually show what you're actually trying to show? So I think the value and the value proposition, not just to end customers, but the other stakeholders. And in our case, especially in smaller groups, not like the Olams of the world, smaller farmers, smaller distributors or wholesalers, we don't have the kind of financial backings and we do not have the financial support. And this is really a category where the finance gap happens. And this is sort of like, well, why is there a finance gap? Oh, because there is no data to provide this. And when you're talking about perishability, oh, that's a very dangerous commodity to touch. So then you can't even go back to transparency or being transparent. So if you think about it the other way, like what Paul is alluding to, then you say, hey, wait a minute, actually by doing traceability, not only are you able to answer it, but this transparency really gives you a commercial value that can actually go to the other stakeholders. So I think that's a very important point, that transparency is not just for the sake of being transparent, but the value that you bring to the table for other stakeholders actually is a lot greater than just pure traceability.
I love that point, Gary, and I'd like everyone to hold on to that thought about how to create value out of transparency, because it is indeed the ultimate end state here, where we provide traceability, increase transparency, but at the same time creating value. Before we jump onto that topic, though, I'd like to talk a little bit more of the genesis of traceability, and of course it's very much driven by customers, consumers, not only the regulation. So what do you see in that sense? What do you hear from your customers? How hard are they pushing for it? And also reflecting on the journey to date, where do you see this going? How do you see it evolving? Maybe Amy, you can provide us a little bit of perspective from your industry and your customers.
Right. So as in the apparel industry, traditionally, in Hong Kong, when Hong Kong used to also export a lot of garments, all you need to do is, can you produce a label in time, fast enough and cheap enough, right? But slowly it evolved into, can you produce a consistent quality of label in the correct color, in time, and in different location, different production location. And that moves on to, especially on the can content label, this can you get your data correct on the can content? And we see that from Nike 10 years ago, when the shipment is being stopped constantly at the China border, where the care label has a slightly awkward and wash care icon. Then you have the whole container of shipment stopped. A lot of them is, of course, to protect their own, domestic brand of kneeling or whatever thing you have. So we see that a lot of countries putting up a lot of rules and regulation on what the garment is supposed to read the label, right? How you wash it and what is the content. And it only gets crazier and crazier as that for political reason or consumer reason. So we decided to develop an IT platform so that these translations and rules and regulations of where the garment needs to go is managed by IT. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, Excel is being sent around the world, and the person at the garment factory is doing the best to try to do the right label based on the Excel sent by the brand owner. But a little person sitting in China trying to do it in Arabic, and you can imagine the mess and the versions of Excel that goes out every day from different brand owners to that garment factory. So we have decided to make this IT platform, so all they need to do is put in some English, and then everything else is correct. And then you start to have a lot of requests on reporting, especially recently, and realize that actually we're sitting on a vast amount of data that is so critical to the supply chain of the apparel industry. So we have now then further added functionality to do analytics of this vast amount of data of where the garment is made, what content the garment is made of. Is it organic? Is it recycled? The percentage, the weight, the ton, how many tons of cotton a brand owner is made in Bangladesh that's organic or that's recycled. And so we see that the data that we are able to provide to the brand owner, we can give them analytics of their sourcing, how sustainable is their sourcing by the season, by the collection, by the department, the men's department, kids department, by the country. And it becomes very important for them to make their decision on a sustainable sourcing plan. And with the B&B reports that we're able to give, we're actually also build that platform to B2C. Right. Because if we can give that information to the brands, we can give similar information to the consumer. Because for the brand owner, it's also very important that they communicate with the consumer to tell them what good work they're doing in their sourcing and manufacturing. Right. So on the care label, we have a QR code that you can just scan, and you can goes straight to that unique garment and where it's made, where it's from, what color, size, and whatever information the brand owner wants to give to the consumer.
Do you see these requests from customers becoming more and more detailed? I mean, do you see?
Yes, because especially in Europe, they have the European Circular Action Plan that needs to be rolled out in 2025.
Yeah.
So there's a target that they have to meet, what kind of reporting, what kind of thing they have to be comply with in Europe. And we only see more and more this coming. And regulation may be very scary for a lot of people. A lot of friends say, oh my God, what do I need to do? What report and where do I get the information from? They probably have all the information. Maybe it's in PDF format.
Yeah.
They need to manage the supply chain. Is my supply chain compliance to the requirements? So on the platform, on the IT, we are also helping the brand owner to track the audit results of their manufacturing, HIC index, FSC, or whatever certification they need, an expiry date and grading. So at the click of a button on the dashboard, they can see which factory is compliant for making whatever goods. So that is also very important now to help the brand owner to manage their supply chain. So they can choose the manufacturing site sustainably.
Based on the criteria. Got it. Thank you, Amy. Paul, any perspective from your side, especially with the regulatory sort of lens on how things are evolving in terms of customer requests or government and customer requests?
I think everything Amy said is reflected also on the food supply chains. We are seeing increased focus by regulators. I tend to think of regulation as coming after innovation. And so regulation compounds or brings together lots of different innovations that are readily available to the market. For those who haven't been keeping up with the innovations over time, it can feel complicated. But I think Amy's right. Our job is to simplify this for our customers. So by having the systems up front that we can have the conversations around what metrics they need and what reports would be easiest, we can produce these systems. So just things that are coming at us, you're seeing cross-border measurements of GHG, for instance. So if your product has a GHG footprint, we're seeing border adjustment mechanisms being discussed that could lead to sort of a VAT-style taxation on the GHG footprint. And that's important for, say, a commodity like rice, which has the second largest footprint of methane right behind livestock. So that's something we're looking at. These environmental footprints are becoming regulated in Europe. So we're going to see product life cycle measurements imposed on the industry and our ability to report to that. We're also seeing regulation embrace some of the digital innovations. So out of the US, I think it's the FDA's blueprint for the future, includes an Internet of Things connected to our mills and warehouses, such that we can more rapidly assess customs clearance at origin prior to shipping by allowing our food safety equipment to report directly into a centralized database. So I think they're looking at integration or convergence of these technologies and platforms to make clearance a quicker process. And I think that's positive.
Right. So we're seeing these there's a trend for various types of demands coming through, most of them requiring more detail, more specificity, more auditable trails, as we heard from Amy. And then, of course, you have all the different government regulations that sometimes they're asking for the same information, but in different format and different sort of versions of it. All that creates a lot of complexity for companies, of course. So I wonder, maybe Gary, from your perspective, where do you see technology coming in here and playing both an enabler role in helping to scale traceability, make it easier, make it cheaper potentially, but also to help to simplify, decomplex some of these increasing demands coming both from the regulatory environment as well as the consumer, the consumer platforms?
I mean, that's a great question. And I think one of the questions that some of the panel, one of the participants have asked about latest technology. So the way we look is very similar to what Amy and Paul are all talking about. But I think for us who are basically from an operator running the business perspective, most of the time people look at solutions in silos and they look at technology in silos as well. But if you really try to think about it, where the biggest problems we are having is that all our different systems are not able to link to a common platform such a way where we can actually have an exchange of information, whether is it internal or external. And many a times when we use our ERP system, it's a very much an internal basis. So when you look at technology and when you try to basically apply technology, there are a couple of things that we all have to basically sort of like sew the different pieces using maybe Amy's technology of textile, right? There are different parts to make a shirt and we all sort of like put it all together. And this is it. So when you look at technology, we first have to talk about the different IoT devices. And then eventually we have to talk about the cloud. Then after that, we have to talk about the blockchain. Then after that, we have to talk about the AI. And then after that, we have to talk about the data analytics that the AI actually produces. Now, all of this is basically sewing the different technology together so that the end result is what we all get, which is really the transparency that can be going across the internal organization as well as to the external organization. But the IoT, the cloud, the database, the blockchain, it is really trying to get the data, digitizing it. So the way we have approached and using technology, it's kind of like, first we use technology to digitize it, then we have to organize it, and then we start to monetize it. So when we talk about technology, combining all this thing together, it is not about the latest blockchain, it's not about the latest AI, it is how does this help so that the transparency that you get actually allows you to cross the different sides between your own organization and the external organization to the regulation, because what the Europeans are doing is very different from what the Americans are trying to do, and what the Chinese are doing is very different from the Southeast Asians are doing. And everyone is trying to do something with more things being layered on. So as a business owner, if we go too deep about the tech, and technology can be very, very deep, sometimes we sort of like miss the plot. So I think the way we use technology, I think we need to basically be clear about what is the end result you want, and then apply the technology to get the results you need. And I think for us, like what you said, getting technology to a level where it's affordable is really the key for what we want to do. Because not everybody is like the bigger firms, you know, who can afford the very expensive consultants to come in. Unfortunately, what we have to do is maybe we have to show them this is how the technologies have been applied and then how it's been used. And maybe we have to just walk the talk, right? And really show it and demonstrate it like what Amy has also done, right? Show people how the care labels are being done, how the labels at the back, the tag label, the packaging, like what she says about rejection on clothing. Can you imagine me rejected on my apples or my rejection on my durians? And there's no return policy. So, you know, they just brought, and I'm in big, big trouble. But the problems that Amy and Paul are mentioning, it's so similar. So is traceability and technology really just because it's something that is hip and trendy, or it is really going to help the world so that we can really build something sustainable? And I think technology can help us on that.
Great. And if I hear you right, Gary, what you're saying, I'd love perspectives from Amy and Paul here. There's no silver bullet when it comes to technology. There in traceability, it's not like one platform can give you the full answer. Do you, Amy, Paul, what do you think about this statement? And also, do you feel that sooner or later we will have that kind of single point of reference that technology might be able to help us, or is it most likely going to be, as Gary described, you know, a different set of systems come together, and obviously for different industry, different value chain, you'll have to create the, you know, put the puzzle together or the pieces a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had that thought many years ago when I look at the care label. Why is it that there's no global standard, right? Everybody comes up with their own standard. EU is probably more advanced because so many countries now have a EU standard. But if you look around the world, I don't know if the global industry will agree on any one particular standard. It may be in the future, but I don't see it so fast right now. But it's so important that the brand is selling internationally, so they have to comply to all these regulations and standards. So I think it's so important for any business to always keep themselves updated on what is required for exporting their goods, and keep the data and find an IT platform to help. Like Gary said, it's not rocket science, actually. You don't need the latest technology, but you do really need to understand what is required of you and keep yourself updated all the time, and to have a partner that can help you to be flexible. Because you don't know what you're going to export to tomorrow. And then what the regulation will change to tomorrow. So it's important to keep updated and find the most suitable IT for yourself.
Paul, any thoughts from your side on technology? Particularly also, I see here we have a question which I think fits quite nicely for Olem's business as well. It says, how can technology help companies overcome, the lack of universal standards? I think we heard some perspectives on that. But more importantly, for companies that have sort of global regulations to deal with, because they operate in a global market and they have to face multiple requirements, how to go about it. Any insight from your business, Paul, especially on the role that technology can help in that complexity?
Yeah, I mean, digital's made this easier. So if you know the regulation that you're needing to track, then obviously keeping abreast of the websites or the Code of Federal Regulations, or out of the European side on RAPSAs, that's on the food side, those are critical. And it is what Amy is saying. So our nutrition labels vary by country, our maximum residue limits for pesticides vary by country. So we do have multiple systems that keep us updated to the current change, but also inform us on where change will be, say, 6 to 12 months out. And those are all government resources, so those are publicly available. And I think that goes back to what Gary's sort of talking about on integrating systems. So making sure that your final need is reflected in your digital platforms in order to simplify things. From our experience being a global player in food, that is one of the services we can provide, is simplicity for our customers. So as you're doing it for yourself, it does become, as you said at the beginning, a differentiator. And there's more and more opportunities for it. As Amy said, already talking about regulation that's expected in 2025, by being in front of it, you become a source for your customers to speak as well. But I want to go back to Gary's comment on these digital systems, because there is something critical here. Technology is a tool, and digital is a tool. In order to feed that tool or set it up right, you're going to need to define things fairly carefully, or what I would call accessibility. You're going to have to know what you have access to data-wise and what's within your capabilities, whether that's regulatory, as it may come to intellectual property, as it may come to global data privacy rights, those limitations on your accessibility, but also your capabilities economically. Where do you need a partner versus what you can do yourself? Those are some critical questions to ask early on to make sure you're not over-invested or developing something that you would be better with an off-the-shelf solution. So I do think getting the data definitions right for what you actually need, or your minimum viable product, I think that's critical to consider.
Great, excellent. And actually, that's a very good segue, Paul, on, as you say, when you start your journey, what you have to consider. I'd like all of you to invite you here for some comments on a very simple yet important question that business may have is, how do you start this journey? What is a good way to think about it for anyone who is running a business and he has a global supply chain or global customers to serve from Asia and so on? What would your advice, either in terms of what are the key building blocks that one has to consider when setting up traceability in their supply chain, and any tips you may have? Anyone would like to go first? Let me pick. I'll start with Amy.
I think for a business, they really need to understand the material first to start with, because that's the building block. How they're sourcing it, but that's a given today that whatever you're sourcing, you always think about sustainability, and then the partner that will make your product or yourself, how do you then understand the regulatory on the requirement of how you manufacture your goods, because there are so many standards out there and so many different requirements from your client that you need to comply to. And once you understand where you're sourcing, how you're making it, and what is a compliance, then you need to have all the data to get yourself ready. Depending on the scope, the size of your business and where you are exporting to or servicing, and then it really then drives how much technology that you are able to fulfill the requirement or to be able to afford this requirement. You can start very economically with your own self being very clear on all the requirements and keeping an Excel spreadsheet. But when you get much bigger, you might want to think about some external help. There are always a lot of people out there with a lot of focus in whichever industry you are, I think, to help. For us, I mean, we have a specialized team sitting in Europe, daily monitoring new regulations coming out from different countries, and also all the certificates that are required by the industry for the manufacturing and the material. So people are sitting there focusing on catching the latest and then advising to all the customers and making them aware. So to really reduce the burden on them having to pay for a full-time person, because we see it in all the brands, they do the same thing. And for us, it's just a value add to send them an email to let them understand. And for us, it's easier. For them, it's very important that they know, right?
Yeah.
And then we change the how the label is made, and they make them aware that the layout of the care label needs to be changed. So there are people out there that can help and hold the information for you and generate a report for you. So it's very important for all the business to know what help is out there, because it's so troublesome or tiresome to do everything by yourself. And there's always somebody out there to help.
Great. Gary, any thoughts from your side on someone who's just starting the journey?
Yeah, I think the journey was similar for myself, right? Because I was running a brand and I was running a distribution company. I was a farmer packing, and then using my finance background. Where I had a big trouble at the beginning was when I was understanding this whole journey, speaking to the different tech people, trying to do different things. And sometimes when you speak to a lot of them, like what Amy said, there are people out there who can help us, but sometimes they also confuse us, right? So in many times, the reason why I eventually set up Dimuto and came out from my operation and really went in together is I can see it, because unlike I think there was a question on pharmaceutical or electronics, where your components are basically manufactured, or pharmaceutical where something is manufactured, the kind of variability is not as wide as that is of food products or fish or meat. And days can change the condition of your goods. And therefore, the kind of requirements and specifications and the needs and clarifications are far more dynamic, as I would say. So I think this journey must be one like what Amy and Paul alluded to. You just have to understand what are your kind of requirements from your customers and your customers' customers. And then you can actually then go back and say, what are the needs that you need to be? If you think that you're going to go out there and say, hey, give me a silver bullet, I got a problem, solve it. That's not going to be very easy for anyone to come in and solve your problem for you. You got to be yourself clear is what is it that you have to do for who, and what is it that you actually get in return. Because at the end, sometimes when people think about cost, sometimes they don't really think of cost as well as the return that you get. Some people just think of the time that you save, or maybe the productivity that goes from forming something that's analog to something digital. But if you have a container of durians of $150,000 sitting in a pot, we got a problem. It's $150,000. It's not just time anymore. So I think this is about the journey of basically starting where you can understand the end result is probably more important than just talking about how to start. But I think the clarity of how the end product should look like is also very important.
Excellent insight. And Paul, any thoughts from your side?
I would encourage everyone to start with what's in their control. And so what I mean by that is I would first map out your value chain. And in mapping out your value chain, don't have fear of mapping out the value chains feeding into your value chains. That's not to say that that's going to lead you to your end result, but it's insightful for the analysis I'm going to suggest. The next thing I think you want to ask within that value chain is what do you have access to? What's the data that you're already sitting on? Or what's the data you can acquire through your relationships within your existing value chain? So almost a data mapping. From that, I would ask you to look at your capabilities. So what are the musts from a regulatory environment or customer perspective? What are the must-nots from a regulatory environment or customer's perspective, contracting perspective? And finally, to Gary's point, what is economically feasible? What are you capable of economically? Once you have that clarity of thought of your library of availability for transparency feeding into traceability, I would encourage you to talk to your customers about what their dream world looks like. What metrics would they love to see, both within a regulatory environment to help them with their own reporting, but also outside the regulatory environment for voluntary certifications or other ambitions they may have to service their consumers. And in doing that, I think you'll be able to come back to one of two decisions. You either can develop something, or you can seek a partnership externally to take something again off the shelf or already existing that will add value into your framework. So if I was recommending sort of a 30,000-foot view of a process, that would be the process I would recommend.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much for these multiple perspectives. It's very, very useful. We'll jump on some audience questions in a minute, but all three of you brought up the point around capabilities and skills here. And I wanted to ask, how do you view, do you see any skill gaps right now in your businesses or with your customers that exist, which are driven by adopting traceability? In other words, is traceability, we want to scale it and it's here to stay, do you see organizations having any major gaps in their skills? And what are those gaps? What is it that's going to be needed from a skills and talent perspective in the future to be able to do more of it? Maybe Amy, I can start off with you, because you obviously, with the garment industry having been doing traceability for quite a few years, be interested in your perspective.
Yeah. So we see that some brands, especially in the sports industry, some very specific niche brand, they are very good at tracking where their garment is made, what is it made of. But the majority of our customers, they feel like they have the data, but they are more and more feel like they cannot dig into it. It's in the PLM somewhere. Maybe it's in a PDF somewhere. So the data, they feel like they should have it, right? They should have it, but how do they use it? So I'm seeing that a lot more brands are slowly putting together a sustainability team and starting to employ a sustainability manager to manage a supply chain. And the manager is then talking to their supplier, what can I get from you? And then they are trying to figure out, how do I put reports together that makes sense? And to be able to get some intelligent data, not just information, but not just data, but information out of the report, so that I can help the sourcing team to make the right decision. So and more they are investing in definitely putting together the sustainability team. And I see that they have an agenda to get things done by 2025. And then they are very excited when they hear that there are solutions out there that can give it to them very quickly. And us being already making the care label, knowing their supply chain, for us, naturally, we can give that information to them so fast because we are sitting on it already.
Yes.
Yes, so the brands are going that way. They're definitely very aware. The push is from the market and the regulatory, and they need to provide. There's no question that the law is pushing them that way. So for us, regulation is also an opportunity. I would say that for any business, you can look at the regulation as a burden, but you can also look at it as an opportunity for your client, for the consumer. How do you then tell the world that you are doing the best you can, right? So I see it in both ways. Yes, it's troublesome, but it's also a value.
Thank you. Paul, Gary, any thoughts from your side on skills? And
well, for me, because we've been hiring quite a bit of people, and I think most young people are thinking that they need to learn, they need to basically come in and they will be taught or something like that. And there seems to be quite a big gap. And especially when we're here in Singapore, I think we have a very, very small pool of people, and we are seeing some gaps in the knowledge. But on a more positive note, I think my message to a lot of the young people who think that there may be a gap, right? I think the programming skills or the ability to program or being able to write or code, I think it's important. But I think we got to basically be able to really come back to one key point. The ability to think is probably the most important thing, right? You can see that the panel that we have been talking about it is really being able to understand the things that we need to do. And if we got people who have the ability to have the skill sets to basically implode a little bit more, apply more critical thinking, understanding, explore, do not be afraid to make mistakes, don't be afraid to basically ask. And then this kind of skills would probably be more valuable than just a skill of just being able to know how to do it in one form of coding or basically saying, I need to learn programming. There are a little bit more. You code and you program because there's a reason for it, rather than you say, I need to have a skill for that. So there are gaps, but I hope the message out there is don't be afraid of the gaps and say, therefore, you can't really be relevant to the new tech world. But I think there's a lot of skills that you can bring to the table that the insights, so even older generations who maybe from a totally different industry can actually come into a tech industry and put different perspective into it as well.
So if I hear you right,
can I just add one point?
Sorry, Amy.
Everybody is on a learning curve, actually.
Yes.
Because it's evolving every day. And the sustainability topic, yes, it's been around, but it's never been hotter. And more people get to it. A lot of new learners anyway. So if you think you don't know anything, you are not the only one.
Anyway,
So be afraid.
Absolutely. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, Gary, if I hear you right, what you're saying is don't use the skills gap as an excuse, right? Not start on the journey. Get going and because there's always going to be new skills required. There's always going to be some gaps, but the most important thing is to get started.
Yeah, and the world is changing so fast, like what Amy is saying, right? I mean, there's things like cryptocurrency, CDC, there are different way of doing exchange, the trade regulation, digital wallets, fintech. Never ends, right? The world is changing and we just have to wake up. And then there's the pandemic, there's a disruption. I got blueberries not being sent over. And then next thing you know, there's an earthquake there, there's a typhoon there, there's the biggest storm coming in a hurricane there. It's every day, right? So we all are learning how to deal with this. And I think, the gap, it's there. But like what Amy said earlier, we're all learning and we've got to learning on the fly. So just embrace it. And I think we're all going to learn a lot more.
Great. Excellent. Let's pick up. We have been answering some of the questions from the panel, from the audience as we go through. There's one particular here. Maybe, Paul, you can help a little bit on that, especially as you have that sort of food customer perspective and where maybe the requirements are a little bit, higher, more stringent given the sensitivity. The question is, are you seeing sustainability, obligations being included in contracts more and more, particularly being mandatory requirements? In other words, if you don't fulfill those transparency criteria, then we're not going to buy from you. You cannot be a supplier. And is that potentially going to be driving even more need for tech? Any perspectives on that?
Yeah, the answer is yes. So there's two drivers behind that, and as of yet, they're not quite regulatory. So one is natural capital accounting. A lot of our larger Western corporate clients are moving to a system where within their profit and loss accounting, they want to bring in environmental and social costs to start bringing in externalities. They're foreseeing a day and age of regulation. And in order to be a better partner, you need to be able to provide the transparency on the product that aids them in those metrics. And so that's absolutely one of the drivers. The second driver is ESG requirements on lending. So oftentimes with green finance, you're finding either tax credits or improved interest rates by committing yourself on the ESG side. And you're seeing that. You're seeing major corporates, including our own, make very large sustainability commitments. In order for those corporates to see those commitments through, they need within their value chain partners that can provide the transparency on what may not show up as an externality in their natural capital accounting, but does further their goal, their promise to their own customers to be a credible brand player that's delivering more than a safe product. It's delivering a safe environment and improved future for the farmers and value chain actors. So absolutely, that's becoming more and more critical. But to Amy's point on these things not just being risks, but opportunities, we've actually seen, and this is part of AtSource. So AtSource has been able to simplify this by getting the customer to think about their metrics up front, embed those metrics into a dashboard system, and then reach all the way through our value chain to the farmer themselves, such that the corporate has access to our value chains, not just in terms of data and auditing, but also in terms of procurement. They can visit the fields, they can understand the practice, and inform themselves of what they need to do next to develop continuous improvement or a scalable model across their entire value chain. So it's been an opportunity for us to service those customers.
Excellent, excellent insights. And Amy, from your perspective, from your customers, how do you see these requirements becoming more and more obligatory for you to be able to win your next contract? You're on mute.
Definitely a must. Yes, we are seeing that if ourselves is not certified by a certain regulatory body, we will not be able to service our customers. We can see that from a garment factory, if they do not have the certain certification for the brand owners, they will not be able to supply the garment. And also it goes down the value chain. If the brand owner is to have a collection on cotton, sustainable cotton, then you need to have the GOTS certificate on the source of your material, and you need to be able to have a platform to show that the transaction certificate, you know, the flow of the material to the garment factory, and then you make this garment and back to the brand owner. This is, you need to prove it as well. So as well as yourself, everything you source down the value chain, and it's required more and more by the brand. And why do they want this? It's because of the consumer and the push from the market. So it's going in that kind of direction more and more these days. So it's a must.
And do you see, Amy, also there's a question in the Q&A on this about the language. Do you see it being quite common, the language across the supply chain in garments, for example? Or do you feel that there are different, different coding, different language that's used? One similarity here, the same in the pharma industry, for example, there are very specific standards that are the same across the value chain, so it's easier to transition from one step to another. Do you see something similar in the garment industry?
Yes, actually, there are quite a few certifications that are like HIC index, and for managing the production facilities, and also as a brand owner, they have a different kind of HIC they can apply to. And then on the material side, there's a lot of GRS certificates, GOTS certificates for the material that you source, depending on which material you're sourcing, whether it's recycled, whether it's cotton, whether it's paper. So there are quite a few, and also blue sign, whether you're using harmful chemicals in your dye, in the way you produce. So there is a lot of specific certificates for material and facilities. And it's very important that for the brand owners to choose one that is recognized by the consumer, is good for environment, and able to execute in the supply chain. So yes, there is some lingo, there are a few, and it's always coming up something new. A new way, a new angle of trying to manage the supply chain, the ethical side of it. So a lot, but yes, there is a scope of it that you can manage, actually. Yes. Great,
excellent. We also have a question here. I want to make sure we answer as many as we can from these that talk specifically about the electronics industry. I know the three of you are representing different industries, but maybe I can pick this up quickly. I have done quite a bit of work in the electrics and electronics industry, and the reality is that yes, the requirements there for traceability and transparency are becoming equally as stringent as in the food or fashion industry, simply because electronics are, consumer goods these days. There's a lot of media attention, a lot of folks from governments around different kind of materials, especially rare materials, rare earth materials, and different types of materials that come from Africa, for example, and some of them have been labeled in the past that they need to be sort of non-slavery, non-conflict type of material. So that level of transparency and traceability is actually even more important for the electronics industry today. And another reason why it's becoming important and will become even more important is because many companies such as Apple and Samsung and all the big electronics players are making, and they will be making, big commitments publicly on recycled material. And the only way you can ensure you have a closed loop in recycling and making sure that if you commit, for example, 100% recycled aluminum or 100% recycled copper by 2030, for them to be able to achieve that commitment, they got to have traceability and transparency in the supply chain to make sure that the copper they put back into their products is truly recycled, is not contaminated by mined material. So the short answer is yes. And Gary, I'm not sure if you have a perspective. Obviously, you're a little bit closer on the tech side on this question about the electronics industry.
No, I agree. I think it's just not food or clothing. I think every one of us having to do that a little bit more. But I think the biggest difference is always, I hate to say this, but the manufacturing side of the game, it's a lot easier when you put traceability, right? Because you can then try to go back to the supplier, and then it sort of like puts in. But when we're doing, for example, I like to use the example of durian. We were doing durian, but you can do durian fresh. But what happens if you put it on a durian cake, right? Then you're talking about a durian moon cake, right? And that's where it gets, like different batch, the different processes. You go into a cake, and then someone complains that the cake isn't good, but which batch do you do this? Now, that gets a bit tricky, and these are kind of like the problems that we are doing. And I think it's not much different in a way of traceability, but you can see that I think the complexity when it comes to a moving live organism, I think it gets a lot more complex. But I think throughout all the industry, as well for consumer, it will make a much better world if we really can see and actually account for the kind of good we do or the damage we do in the things we sell, right? And I think it's about time that people get to be accountable, and then consumers can actually reward those who put in the extra effort.
Yeah, excellent. And actually, we have 3 minutes to go, and I think it's been a fantastic conversation. I'd like to give you all maybe a few seconds or so to just share your closing remarks around traceability. It could be any of the topics we already touched on, evolution, or any final thoughts that you may want to share with our audience, who is extremely excited about this opportunity. Maybe I can start with Paul now.
Okay. I think we've already established at the beginning that this is a must, and it's becoming more and more important for servicing customers, but you can turn it into an opportunity by being in front of it. The one thing I would add to this conversation, and Amy brought it up through transfer certification, that we haven't really talked about, is getting familiarity, for those of you who aren't, with chain of custody standards. That's been sort of left out of this conversation. So whether that's mass balance or segregation or identity preservation, because that does speak to the capabilities that you can finally offer within your supply chains. And that's been a major conversation within the food supply chains. What can we actually do? What can we actually identify? And where does our traceability end? For rice, for instance, we'll have multiple farmers deliver to a single site, a mill. We can't identity preserve the farmer behind the mill because the way we process is in large batches. So understanding that as you're understanding your accessibility, I would want to reinforce. But otherwise, it's been educational for me, and I really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you so much.
Excellent. Amy, any thoughts from your side?
Yes, I think it's great listening to Gary and Paul. I love the durian examples.
Yeah.
and you think apparel industry is complex, but when you hear about the food and perishable, it's even worse, right?
Yeah.
So and I think the most important, I really think, is to understand the market. To understand your customer, your client, the regulatory, and what you can do, and find the best way forward, not necessarily the most technical, but the best for your own company, for your own need. So I wish everybody luck with this journey, because it's here to stay. The sustainability can only get bigger.
Excellent. That's a very good way to end this. And Gary, any final thoughts from your side?
Well, I think thank you again. It's great having Jerry, Amy, and Paul, having this conversation that we have. But I think that the conclusion is kind of clear, and I agree. This is one of those journeys that, it's starting and it's not going to end. And I think we all can basically take the takeaway. The biggest takeaway is that we just are trying to close the loop, right? The loop basically requires us to digitize. It's almost like when Apple started to change the music world by putting your veneer and your tape into a digital format. I think what we're all trying to do right now is putting fruits and durians into a digital format so that we can all see that in the end. But really, it really gets the transparency that we bring to the table and the value add and the kind of like the custody, the burden of proof, the ability to differentiate the black sheeps and the white sheeps, and the kind of work that you can actually be doing. It is really something that I think traceability is not so much a pain in the neck, but it really is really an opportunity that will change the world.
Excellent. And on this very positive and high note from our panelists, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to attend this important webinar. But a bigger thank you to Amy, Paul, and Gary for sharing with us these fantastic insights. Indeed, traceability is here to stay. It might be a little bit more costly today, but it's definitely a differentiator for the future and even for today. And we heard how that is possible. And even if it generally looks difficult, it's important to start it and figure out the way as it goes along with the right skills, the right partnering, and totally an open mind. Thank you all for attending our discussion. Brian, I'm going to pass back to you.
Thanks, Jerry. So I'd like to thank all our panelists today, Gary, Amy, Jerry, and Paul, for sharing their valuable insight and knowledge. Special shout out as well to Vinay and the team from Bain and Company for their help with organizing this event. So thank you all to all audience members today for sending in your questions. So unfortunately, we won't be able to cover all the questions due to your time constraints, but thank you once again for engaging with us. So for our audience today, do also take note that we'll be sending out a post-event email with all the important information you need, including a recording for this webinar. So do keep an eye out for that. So, and with that, we've come to the end of our webinar today. Thank you all for spending your Monday afternoon with us. And on behalf of SGInnovate, I would like to wish all of you a great week ahead, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next event. Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.